The lake didn't drain itself. Someone just finally pulled the truth out from under it. I remember the sound first, not the sight. A dry, hollow crack echoing across what used to be 30 acres of water, like the earth itself was exhaling after holding a secret too long. People were already gathering along the shoreline, or what used to be shoreline, standing there in their pastel jackets and polished boots, staring down at mud that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The smell hit next. Wet earth, algae, something old and buried finally exposed. And beneath it all, that faint metallic tang of something engineered, something controlled. That's when the shouting started. HOA board members scrambling, phones out, voices sharp and panicked, trying to figure out how their centerpiece, Willow Creek Lake, their pride, their property value crown jewel, had dropped nearly 8 feet overnight. I just stood there at the edge, hands in my jacket pockets, boots pressed into the damp ground, feeling the cold creep up through the soles like it had 3 nights ago when everything I had burned to ash. 72 hours earlier, I was standing in a very different kind of silence. The kind that comes after fire. The kind where the air still tastes like smoke and resin and something you can't replace before winter hits. My woodpile, 6 cords of seasoned oak, stacked tight, covered, ready for the freeze, gone. My food stores, smoked venison, canned vegetables, everything I'd spent months preparing, reduced to warped metal lids and blackened glass. The smell was still clinging to my clothes, sharp and bitter, cutting through the cold like it belonged there. I didn't call the cops. I didn't yell. I just stood there, listening to the faint hiss of something still smoldering under the ash, and I knew. Because fires like that don't start themselves in 40-degree weather with no wind and damp ground. Fires like that get lit. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I live just outside Willow Creek Estates, off-grid by choice, on land my father bought before anyone here knew what an HOA was. I don't bother anyone. I don't attend their meetings. I don't follow their rules because legally, I don't have to. And people like Margaret Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of community standards, don't like things they can't control. She'd made that clear the day she stood at the edge of my property line, heels sinking into dirt she didn't own, smiling like she already had. This kind of setup, she said, glancing at my wood stacks, my smokehouse, my tools, it sends the wrong message. I remember the way her perfume cut through the pine air, sweet and artificial, like something trying too hard to belong. I didn't argue. I just nodded and let her talk. People like Maggie always talk more when you don't push back. And that was the first mistake she made. Because while she was busy seeing a problem, I was already calculating the solution. I learned a long time ago that silence makes people careless, and Maggie Whitmore was nothing if not predictable when she thought she had already won. The morning after the fire, her golf cart rolled up slow along the gravel edge of my property, tires crunching like it was some kind of parade. I could hear it before I saw her, that soft electric hum cutting through the cold air, followed by the faint clink of her travel mug shifting in the cup holder. She stopped just short of the charred ground, careful not to get her polished shoes dirty, and gave me that same tight smile she always wore when she thought she was being reasonable. "Terrible accident," she said, drawing the word accident out like it had already been decided in a meeting I was not invited to. The smoke was still rising in thin gray lines behind me, carrying that bitter smell of burned oak and spoiled food, and it mixed with her perfume in a way that made my stomach turn. I nodded once, slow, letting the moment stretch. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice even. "Terrible." She glanced around, eyes scanning what used to be order, now reduced to blackened piles and twisted metal lids catching the light. "You know," she continued, folding her arms, "there have been concerns about fire hazards, improper storage, non-compliant structures. It might be time to reconsider how you are operating out here." There it was. Not sympathy, not concern, just positioning. I could feel the cold air biting at my ears, the kind that settles in before a hard freeze, and I thought about how long it would take to rebuild what I had lost if I played this straight. Weeks, maybe months. Time I did not have. I looked past her, toward the line of trees that separated my land from theirs, and beyond that, the lake. Still, quiet, reflecting that pale winter sky like nothing had changed. "I will manage," I said. She gave a small shrug, like she had done her part, then turned the cart around and drove off, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and the faint smell of synthetic vanilla. That was the second mistake she made. Because what she saw as cleanup, I saw as confirmation. I waited until her cart disappeared behind the hedges before I moved. The ground was still warm in spots, soft under my boots as I walked the perimeter of what used to be my supply. The details were all there if you knew how to look. Burn patterns too even. Residue that did not belong to wood or food. A faint sheen on a half-melted lid that caught the light just right. I crouched down, brushing ash aside with my glove, and there it was. Not much. Just enough. The kind of trace that tells you this was planned, not accidental. My breath came out slow, visible in the cold, and I felt that familiar shift in my chest. Not anger. Not panic. Just clarity. I stood up and looked again toward the lake, toward the dam that fed it, toward the system I had studied years ago when I worked water control contracts across 3 states. Most people saw that lake as scenery. Property value. Weekend views. I saw pressure levels, outflow gates, legal filings, and something far more important than water. Control. And right then, with the smell of smoke still clinging to my jacket and winter closing in by the hour, I understood exactly what 72 hours was worth. 72 hours sounds like a long time until you start breaking it down into what actually matters. Because in my line of work it was never about days. It was about pressure, timing, and who understood the system better than the people pretending to own it. I went inside what was left of my place, the air still, carrying that burnt edge, and pulled out the only thing that mattered more than supplies right now, my old field binder. The cover was worn smooth from years of use, corners bent, pages thick with notes, permits, diagrams, things most people would never bother to read twice. I flipped it open on the table, the paper making that dry, familiar sound, and landed right where I knew I would, watershed maps for Willow Creek Basin. Most people think that lake belongs to the HOA because they pay fees and maintain the walking paths and install those little decorative lights along the shore. But water does not care about landscaping, and it definitely does not care about neighborhood votes. Water follows permits, elevation, and whoever holds the rights upstream. I traced the contour lines with my finger, feeling the slight indentations where I had pressed too hard years ago. And there it was again, exactly how I remembered it, the small control structure just beyond the tree line, technically off HOA property, feeding everything they built their little paradise around. Back when I was doing contract work, we installed those systems with one goal in mind: control seasonal overflow, prevent flooding, manage drought cycles, all by the book, all perfectly legal, and always tied to whoever held the original land use agreements. My father signed those agreements before this place ever had a name, before Maggie Whitmore ever decided she could measure other people's lives with a clipboard and a smile. I grabbed my phone and started making calls, not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just the kind that moved things quietly in the background. County Records Office first, confirming filing numbers I already knew were there, then the State Water Management Database, pulling up permits that had not been reviewed in years because nobody thought they mattered anymore. The woman on the line sounded bored until I read off the authorization code tied to my property, and then her tone shifted just enough for me to know I was in the right place. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. I just asked the right questions and listened to the pauses between her answers. That was always where the truth lived. By the time I hung up, the picture was clear, clearer than the smoke that had filled my yard the night before. They had built their lake around a system they did not fully control. And worse, they had made changes, small ones, landscaping adjustments, shoreline grading, things that looked harmless on the surface but shifted load distribution just enough to matter when someone who understood the design decided to intervene. I stepped back outside, the cold sharper now, biting through my jacket, and looked toward the tree line again. The lake sat still in the distance, smooth as glass, reflecting a sky that promised a hard freeze by morning. People would be out there soon, jogging paths, dog walkers, kids feeding ducks, all of them thinking that water was permanent, that it belonged to them because it had always been there. I let out a slow breath and watched it fade into the air. They burned what kept me alive through winter, and in doing that, they forced me to remember exactly what I was capable of when I stopped thinking like a neighbor and started thinking like an engineer. 72 hours was not a threat, it was a schedule, and by the time that clock ran out, the only thing left for them to stand on would be ground they never thought they would see. By hour 12, the cold had settled in deep enough to stiffen the ground under my boots, and that was exactly how I needed it, because systems like the one feeding that lake respond differently when the temperature drops. Pressure lines tighten, flow slows, and every small adjustment starts to matter more than people realize. I moved before sunrise, not because I was in a rush, but because I preferred working when everything else was still quiet, when the only sound was frost cracking underfoot and the distant hum of nothing happening yet. The tree line swallowed me up as I stepped off my property, branches brushing against my jacket, leaving behind a faint dusting of ice crystals that melted into the fabric. I knew this path better than anyone out there jogging with headphones and water bottles later in the morning, because I had walked it years ago when we installed the original control points, when this entire area was still just land and intention, not manicured edges and artificial views. The structure came into view slowly, concrete edges worn but solid, metal housing dulled by time and weather, tucked just far enough out of sight that most people forgot it existed, which was exactly how it was designed. Out of sight, but never out of control. I ran my glove across the surface, feeling the cold metal, the slight vibration underneath, subtle but steady, the kind you only notice when you know what to listen for. It was still active, still tied into the same system that regulated inflow and outflow between seasonal runoff and reservoir levels. Nothing had changed there. What had changed was everything built around it. I knelt down and opened the access panel, the hinges letting out a low groan that echoed in the still air, and inside, everything looked exactly as it should. Gauges, manual overrides, lock mechanisms, all intact, all waiting. That was the thing about infrastructure. It does not care who is in charge on paper. It responds to whoever understands it. I did not touch anything yet. Not a single adjustment. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I checked the readings, pressure levels, current retention volume, downstream tolerance. Numbers do not lie, and these numbers told me exactly what I needed to know. They had increased shoreline retention over the past year, probably to keep the lake looking fuller, cleaner, more appealing for their listings, but in doing so, they reduced the margin for controlled release. They tightened the system without reinforcing the logic behind it. I closed the panel carefully, making sure everything looked untouched, because right now, this was not about action, it was about timing. I stepped back and looked out through the trees, catching a glimpse of the water beyond, still calm, still reflecting that same quiet confidence that comes from people believing something will always be there. I checked my watch, slow and deliberate, then turned and walked back the way I came, each step measured, each movement part of something already set in motion. By hour 24, I had everything confirmed, every document aligned, every legal angle secured in a way that would hold under scrutiny, because this was never going to be about force, it was going to be about inevitability. By hour 48, the weather dropped another 10 degrees, tightening everything further, setting the stage without anyone noticing. And by the time the first residents started their weekend routines, coffee in hand, walking dogs along that perfectly maintained path, the system they trusted without question was already operating under a different set of rules, ones written long before they arrived, ones they never thought to check, ones that did not ask for permission before doing exactly what they were designed to do. By hour 48, the air had that brittle edge to it, the kind that makes every sound travel farther and every mistake harder to hide. And that was when I knew the timing had lined up exactly the way I needed it to. I did not rush back to the control structure right away, because the most dangerous move at this point would have been acting too early. Instead, I took the long route along the outer edge of the property line, boots crunching over frost-hardened gravel, watching the neighborhood wake up like nothing had changed. Porch lights flicked off one by one, garage doors hummed open, and the faint smell of coffee drifted through the cold air as people stepped out into a morning they thought they understood. The lake sat there in the distance, still and full, catching the pale sunlight in a way that made it look permanent, like it had always been part of their lives and always would be. I stopped for a second, just long enough to take it in, because this was the last moment it would ever look like that again. When I reached the tree line, the silence closed in again, heavier this time, like the land itself was waiting. I moved through the branches slowly, keeping my steps deliberate, not because anyone was watching, but because this part mattered. Every system has a point where intention becomes action, where planning stops being theoretical and starts being irreversible. The structure came into view, unchanged from the day before, quiet, steady, doing exactly what it had been told to do for years without question. I knelt down again, brushing frost from the metal surface, and opened the panel. The hinges gave that same low groan, but this time it sounded different, like it carried weight. Inside, the gauges were exactly where I expected them to be, pressure holding, retention maxed higher than it should have been for this temperature range, just like the data had shown. They had pushed the system too far for aesthetics, for appearance, for the illusion of control. I rested my hand near the manual override, not touching it yet, just feeling the cold radiate off the metal. This was not about forcing anything. The system was already under strain. All I had to do was let it operate the way it was designed to under the right conditions. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the printed authorization, the one tied to upstream management rights that had been sitting untouched in county records for years. The paper felt stiff in the cold, edges sharp against my glove, a quiet reminder that this was not sabotage, not interference, but a correction. I secured it inside the panel where it belonged, documenting the adjustment point the way it should have been done all along, and then I made the smallest movement that mattered. Just enough to shift the balance. Just enough to tell the system to start correcting itself. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden rush, just a subtle change, a low hum deep inside the structure, like something waking up after being ignored for too long. I closed the panel and stood up slowly, stepping back as the mechanism settled into its new instruction set. Out beyond the trees, nothing looked different yet. The lake still held its shape, still reflected the sky, still fooled everyone who looked at it. But I knew what was happening beneath the surface, how the levels would start to adjust, how pressure would redistribute, how the illusion would begin to slip 1 inch at a time. I checked my watch again, the seconds moving steady and indifferent, and turned away from the structure without looking back. By the time anyone noticed, it would already be too late to stop, because systems like this do not respond to panic, they respond to design. And for the first time since the fire, I felt the cold without the smoke, the silence without the loss, replaced by something far more precise. Not revenge, not anger, just the quiet certainty that everything was now moving exactly the way it was supposed to. By hour 60, the change was no longer theoretical. It was visible if you knew where to look, and more importantly, if you knew what used to be there before. I stood along the far edge of the tree line again, not hiding, just observing, hands tucked into my jacket as the cold pushed deeper into the morning air. The lake still looked full to anyone walking the paved path, still reflected the sky in that calm, perfect way that made real estate photos sell faster, but the edges were different now. Subtle, almost polite. The waterline had pulled back maybe 2 inches along the north bank, just enough to expose a thin strip of darker soil that had not seen daylight in years. Most people would miss it. They always do. But systems do not shift without leaving a signature, and this one was starting to write its story across every inch of that shoreline. I could hear it too, if I focused, that faint, low movement beneath the stillness, like water redirecting itself somewhere out of sight, following instructions it had been waiting a long time to receive. Down on the walking path, a couple passed by with a dog, laughing about something small, unaware that the ground beneath their routine was already changing. Further along, a maintenance cart rolled slowly, one of the HOA guys checking trash bins, probably thinking about weekend schedules and not structural flow rates. That was the thing about control. People only notice it when it disappears. By hour 66, the shift became harder to ignore. I drove into town for supplies I no longer needed just to pass by the main overlook, the one with the wooden railing and the little brass plaque talking about community investment and environmental harmony. The parking lot was fuller than usual, a few residents standing there, pointing toward the water, voices low but carrying that edge of confusion. The lake had dropped another few inches. Enough now that the symmetry was off. Rocks that used to sit just below the surface were breaking through, uneven, disrupting the clean line Maggie had worked so hard to maintain. I leaned against the tailgate of my truck for a minute, listening. Must be evaporation, someone said. Another voice followed, less certain. In this temperature? I kept my eyes on the water, watching the way the surface tension shifted near the far side where the feed line balanced outflow. It was working exactly as expected. No spikes, No instability. Just a steady correction, inch by inch, hour by hour. By the time I got back to my place, the cold had settled into something heavier, the kind that made everything feel quieter, like the world was holding its breath. I stepped out and looked toward the distant line of trees again, knowing what was happening beyond them without needing to see it directly. This was the part most people never understand. They think change happens all at once, loud and obvious. But real change, the kind that cannot be stopped, happens gradually, so gradually that by the time anyone decides to react, the outcome is already locked in. By hour 70, the call started. I could hear them faintly through the still air, distant voices, engines starting, doors closing a little faster than usual. Something was wrong, and people could feel it now even if they could not explain it. Off to the side near the old tree line where the ground dipped slightly, giving me a clear view without putting me in the middle of their panic. The shoreline had pulled back nearly a full yard now, exposing dark, uneven bands of mud and rock that looked out of place against the manicured edges they had spent years maintaining. The smell was different too, heavier, earthier, like something ancient being uncovered layer by layer. You could hear it in the air, not the water itself, but the people, voices overlapping, sharp, confused, trying to assign blame to something they did not understand. Between chaos and correction, Maggie's voice rose again, sharper now, cutting through the noise. "We have professionals looking at the issue," she said. But even as she spoke, one of the workers near the path shook his head slightly, subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. He was already seeing what she was not ready to accept. This was not a malfunction. This was authorized flow. I turned slightly, letting my gaze move across the scene one last time, taking in the way everything they built their confidence on was now shifting beneath them, not violently, not dramatically, but with a steady, undeniable logic that no meeting or vote could override. No one looked at me. No one thought to. To them, I was just another resident, another observer in a crowd trying to understand what they were losing. And that was the final mistake. Because while they were busy searching for someone to blame, the system had already finished making its decision. The lake was never theirs to control. They just never realized it until it stopped behaving the way they expected. The first official response came faster than I expected, but not fast enough to matter, because once a system starts correcting itself, paperwork is just a delayed reaction to something already in motion. By mid-morning, county vehicles rolled in, white trucks with state seals on the doors, tires crunching over gravel with a kind of authority that cut through the noise of the crowd. You could feel the shift immediately. The residents stepped back, voices lowering, uncertainty turning into something sharper, something closer to concern. Maggie noticed it too. I watched her posture change as one of the officials approached, clipboard in hand, jacket zipped tight against the cold. He did not greet her like someone in charge. He spoke to her like someone asking questions that already had answers. That was the difference. I stayed where I was, just outside the main cluster, close enough to hear pieces of the conversation carried by the wind. Words like permit, release authorization, and upstream rights floated through the air, heavy and precise, not the kind of language you can talk your way around. Maggie tried. I could see it in the way her hands moved, controlled at first, then sharper, pointing toward the lake, toward the workers, toward anything that might shift attention away from the real issue. But every time she spoke, the official just nodded once, slow, then looked back at his notes like the outcome had already been filed. Down by the lower access path, the maintenance crew had opened the secondary panel, and even from a distance, I could tell they were seeing the same thing I had seen hours ago. No damage. No failure. Just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do under the authority it was legally tied to. The lake had dropped another few inches while everyone argued, the waterline pulling back steadily, exposing more of the uneven bottom, roots, stones, things that had been hidden under years of controlled appearance. The smell had deepened now, richer, heavier, carrying that unmistakable scent of exposed earth and shifting water. People started taking pictures, stepping closer, shoes sinking slightly into ground that had not been meant to hold weight. I could hear someone say, "Is this even safe?" And that question hung in the air longer than anything else. Because safety, like control, is something people assume until it is taken away. Maggie's voice cut through again, louder now, but there was a crack in it, something strained. "This must be a mistake," she said, but even she sounded like she did not fully believe it anymore. The official responded with something I could not fully hear, but I caught enough. Filed authorization, pre-existing rights, compliance. Words that do not argue. Words that end arguments. I shifted my stance slightly, letting my gaze move across the lake one more time. The surface was no longer smooth, no longer reflecting that perfect, controlled image they had relied on. It was broken now, interrupted by reality, by the underlying structure they never bothered to understand. That was the part most people miss. They think control comes from ownership, from rules, from appearances. But real control comes from knowing how things actually work beneath all of that. And right now, every inch of that. Lake was proving a point that no meeting, no vote, no carefully worded notice could undo. I turned away before anyone thought to look in my direction, boots pressing into the cold ground with a steady rhythm, leaving the noise behind. By the time they finished asking questions, the answer would already be obvious. The system had not failed them. It had corrected them. By the time the officials finished their inspection, the lake had already dropped far enough that no one was talking about aesthetics anymore. No one was worried about reflections or property values or the color of the shoreline, because what they were looking at now was something real, something structural, something they could not smooth over with landscaping and polite emails. I came back just before sunset, the cold sharper now, biting through layers, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there. The crowd had thinned, replaced by smaller groups standing in quiet clusters, voices lower, heavier, like they were trying to process something that did not fit the story they had been telling themselves about this place. The waterline had pulled back nearly 10 feet in some areas, exposing cracked mud, scattered rocks, and the skeletal outlines of old roots that had been hidden for years. The smell of wet earth had taken over completely, thick and honest, nothing like the clean, controlled scent they used to maintain around the lake. Down near the main overlook, Maggie stood with two officials, her posture rigid, arms crossed tight. The confidence she used to carry like a uniform now stripped down to something defensive. I could not hear everything, but I did not need to. The tone was enough. Measured. Final. The kind of conversation where explanations are no longer being accepted, only recorded. One of the officials handed her a document, and even from a distance, I recognized the format. Notice of compliance enforcement. Not a suggestion, not a warning. A correction backed by law that had been sitting in place long before she ever stepped into power. She took it, but her hands were not as steady as they had been a few days ago when she stood at the edge of my land pretending to offer advice. That moment stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because of what she said then, but because of what she could not say now. I walked a little closer, stopping just short of the main path, close enough to see the lake bed stretching out in uneven patterns, the water now confined to a narrower channel, flowing exactly where it was supposed to all along. No chaos, no damage, just exposure. That was the part people struggle with. They expect justice to look dramatic, loud, undeniable in a single moment. But most of the time, it looks like this. Quiet, methodical, unavoidable. I turned away from the lake and looked back toward my own land, toward the blackened ground that had started all of this. The ash was still there, but the smell had faded, replaced by the clean, sharp air of winter settling in. I had already started rebuilding, small steps, stacking what I could salvage, planning what came next. Because that is the difference. They acted thinking they could erase something. I responded by reminding them what was always there beneath their control. As I walked back, the sound of the wind moved across the exposed lake bed, carrying a low, hollow tone that echoed against the remaining water, like the land itself was resetting. No one followed me. No one called out. To them, I was still just a man who kept to himself, someone outside their system. And that was exactly where I intended to stay. Because in the end, I did not take anything from them. I did not destroy anything. I just let the system do what it was designed to do once the right conditions were in place. They burned what kept me alive through winter, thinking it was just wood and food. What they did not understand was that survival is not about what you store. It is about what you know. And knowledge does not burn. It waits. It adapts. And when the time comes, it corrects everything.